Okay, so picking up where we left off, remember, always think function when analyzing any group of people. Cultural evolution has gone through some iterations. There's some neo-evolutionists. Leslie White is kind of one of these universal evolutionists, or universal evolutionism, which is the idea that um, people will kind of all evolve, but in different ways and different processes, is not down the same line necessarily like this unilineal evolution that Morgan thought of. However, again, I personally, again, this is my own personal kind of preference. Evolution is a loaded term, and almost when I ask classes and individuals what they think of evolution, they always think that there's some pinnacle to evolution. And this is how Morgan basically talks about it, right? That civilization is this pinnacle of thought and pinnacle of culture. Um, Even in biology, uh, evolution itself as a term has come to be thought of as this pinnacle piece. And really, what we're talking about with the term evolution is process and change. And then when we get into function, then we're starting to actually describe what evolution is. So a lot of times, again, um, I use in physical anthropology this example of the skinny computer scientist in the Silicon Valley, not necessarily our version, or at least our cultural version of what we would say is survival of the fittest. Fittest usually people think of as fit, physically fit. Again, if we look at function, and in terms of who this individual might attract and mate with, we're really looking at what is the function of the job or the economic structure of the culture. So we really need to start breaking these things down to kind of analyze them. And function in evolution has a key piece, right? Sometimes it could be a negative function if we have a certain mutation. I know that I have alpha-1 antitrypsin mutation. It's basically a genetic liver disorder that my mother passed down to me. When I look at its function right now, in terms of what science is telling me, is that this is not good for your liver or your lungs. Basically, it's a protein issue with cleaning out my lungs. However, what we don't know is that's the negative function, but is there a positive function? Is it eliminating something else in my body? Like, hypothetically, my hope is that it would eliminate things like cancer. Now, that's obviously a giant hope, but we can look at similar, using that analogy, we can do that with culture. And what I mean by that is that analyzing hunter-gatherers, it seems like they spend a lot of time gathering food and kind of working, what we would call work, really because it's with our hands. So we've been taught that working with our hands is more work than not. Again, hunter-gatherers worked 10 to 20 hours a week, especially in California, especially on the coast. You're really looking at 10 hours a week. And when we talk about work for hunter-gatherers, we're talking about building shelter and food prep, which means hunting, gathering, and cooking. What's fascinating about us in our time is when we talk about a work week, we don't include food prep, which is going to the grocery store or sitting in a drive-through or cooking or cleaning. We don't consider that work, okay? But they were ultimately working for their basic needs. We are now kind of working to build upon our economic value, which is very different. It has different function. And again, I am not in the world of judgment in terms of what's better or what's right or what's wrong. That's down below when we get into the binaries. That's exactly what it is. I'm more into looking at function, right? And looking at some of these aspects to things. So really be able to dissolve kind of this idea of pinnacle evolution and then functionalism, which maintains this certain level of cultural relativity, because we could say, well, why are they doing this ceremony? Why are they doing this ceremony where it's like everybody's eating all their crops in one day? Well, it turns out that the ceremony produces a cohesive element for that group for a whole year. So one day eating crops equals 1 year of peace among a group. They don't have to fight over resources anymore, and they shared that moment, and it had symbolic value. This is where I blend symbolism and functionalism. So functionalism tends to be a lot of the theory in anthropology, and it's a major critique of evolution. And even in the change element, diffusion has some function. Diffusing ideas, transferring ideas, those can have some function. Also, there's the other piece of change for functionalists is individual ingenuity or isolated development. So not everything is passed on. Obviously, it's the chicken and the egg. Somebody has to think of it first or come up with the process or the plan. So some groups pass things on. Some groups came up with things. And this is just kind of how humanity kind of has worked through this cultural process for the last 250,000, 300,000 years. So structuralism, again, remember, is kind of the underlying patterns behind things. Strauss uses his idea of binaries to display the idea of how we are taught to think of things in categories. And again, this is where he gets into labeling things like black, white, right, wrong, no, yes. These are binary structures. The idea of polar opposites in the dialectic instead of going through the synthesis part. But what he says is that Western culture especially has created this structure of binaries that are helpful in learning process, especially at a young age, but are not super helpful when we get into more complex ideas. It tends to make us kind of stuck in boxes and in thinking. But also, what he's saying is that because we have this binary structure, this is the pattern of our culture, we're not going to be able to break free of that, really, because this is the underlying pattern behind our culture that is kind of this structural component. Think of it as kind of the matrix, zeros and ones, kind of behind the computer screen. This is what he would say is that, and again, what's fascinating about that analogy is that he's exactly talking about binary. And what we talk about with computer programming and stuff is binary codes, it's zeros and ones, and it's really the idea of yes or no, right or wrong, right? And this is how we learn, and this is the pattern that we use. Computer programs developed Western. We developed a binary structure for them as well. Materialism, Marxist anthropology, cultural materialism. Remember, we talked about Marvin Harris, the sacred cow, the reason for the cow being alive. It looks like early humans, in the video it talks about this, early humans utilized animals not for meat first, but for maybe milk and working the fields, more like the South Asian Indian population in terms of Hindu, continue that today. And really, materialism is looking at energy, much more kind of scientific cultural ecology pieces, how humans interact with the environment. Feminist anthropology, remember we had Ortner kind of critique the idea of male being culture and female being nurture. We start to get into the menstruation huts and the menstruation caves and females going into the field and opening up a whole vast knowledge bank that we didn't have because the field was dominated by males prior. We had Sally Slocum kind of do her interesting investigation into who brought back the most calories to the group. Was it man the hunter or women the gatherer? And it was overwhelmingly female. Symbolic interpretism, we're going to get into further, obviously, as we go down this road. Turner and Gertz. And remember, Gertz talked about thick description and really looked at the underlying symbolism. So, again, it's kind of fascinating to think about all these different layers, right? We can kind of stack functionalism on top of structuralism. So let's say the structuralism is the pattern, and we have this binary structure, and then we can ask, well, what is the function of this binary structure? Well, it's really good at us transferring knowledge. That's what it's good for, because it puts things in categories for us naturally. So this helps. Now, what we can do and kind of add another layer to that, in front of that, or even behind it, depending on how you look at it, we could look at symbolism or interpretism, which is this underlying kind of, are we sure that the picture of the rhino is really trying to convey to us the picture of a rhino? Or is it trying to convey to us that there's an extinction event going on? Again, we can come up with all kinds of metaphors and symbolism to it. And what Gertz and Turner are really pointing out here is that humans think in symbols, and it's been with us for a very, very long time. So again, this is why I say it could be behind structuralism or in front, depending on the way that we look at it. Remember, a materialist is going to look at it for a material aspect, not a symbolic aspect. Practice theory is Bordeaux. Pierre Bordeaux. Remember, we get into praxis, which is basically habits, practice, everyday life, that nitty-gritty stuff that we really need to look at. Postmodernism was a critique of kind of all the sciencey side of cultural anthropology that tried to put out general theory and stuff like that of why humans do what they do. Postmodernists are basically like, we're all subjective individuals and we need to kind of identify with that, right? Activists and anarchists, David Graeber was your assignment for kind of this last week, and he kind of represents both in this way. Activism, again, can be a tricky road to go down in terms of ethical or unethical behavior in the field. Going back to symbolic and interpretivism, I had you guys do some symbolic work last week, and again, this is to make you think of what is symbols. Some individuals gave me, like, I give you a picture of an American flag. The American flag is not a symbol for the American flag. The American flag to us in terms of symbol should be things like freedom, liberty, Constitution, 50 states, whatever that equals. The star stands for 50 states. That in itself is a symbol. It's not actually the state on the flag, so it's a symbol. So we really need to kind of make sure that we put symbols and symbology and symbolism in its place when we're moving forward in terms of talking about culture. All right, so in terms of the bulk of the lecture this week, it's going to be on modes of livelihoods. Some people call it modes of production, which is basically how you feed yourself. Modes of livelihoods is a better description on how we actually survive. So what we get is these are the different levels, and we're going to run through them. Hunting, gathering, and foraging all fit in kind of the same place. Fishing, scavenging, those would also be included in foraging. Horticulture, horticulture is small gardens, so we're now getting more into the mode of agriculture. Pastoralism, again, is nomadic peoples, at least early on, having animals around for their protein sources, and it could have been to eat them or to milk them, but really, and to have the milk as a protein, fat, sugar source, but really it is for a livelihood purpose. Agriculture, obviously we all know what that is, and it can be both animal husbandry, which is domestication of animals, and also plant domestication. Industrial, digital economies is what we're in currently. Most of us don't work manually growing our food and subsist only on that, so we're not horticulturalists. We don't just raise cows or goats or sheep and live on their milk, so we're not pastoralists. We usually don't forage. A lot of people don't forage anymore, unless you're riding around You're riding around on your bike and you see an orange tree and you pick an orange off of somebody's tree, which is not necessarily legal depending on where you're standing. That is a minor version of foraging. So with that, in industrial digital economies, we are looking more at the service sector of things, right? That farming is now done at an industrial level. Factory farming, those kinds of things are eliminating really the bulk of the population's attachment or connection to the actual production of fulfilling that number one basic need, which is food. Food security, obviously super, super important. We have, and we'll get into the food security and the dependency issue that we have now in terms of the factory farms. Subsistence versus poverty. Living on the fringes and kind of surviving would be kind of subsistence, right? Poverty has different connotations to different people. One particular is that you don't have enough food to feed yourself. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of, are we subsisting on just what we need? Do we have too much and we're throwing away food, or do we not have enough food? So these are kind of the big picture points that we're going to go through for the day.